olfactory inversion. A man's sense of smell is reversed, so fragrances smell like stenches and vice versa. His nose has dyslexia. To skip through a field of lilacs in early spring is equivalent to being tethered to a corpse during the high heat of summer. The aroma of freshly baked bread is like the effluvia from an army's combat boots after they have marched through a swamp for several weeks without stopping. When the nose has dyslexia, the conventions of clean and dirty are shot to hell. Nightmares of being dunked in vats of perfume become the norm. Social status disintegrates, and intimacy with a skunk brings joy. The man becomes a hermit, burrowing into a remote dung heap, further and further away than the tyrannies of soap. The conduit. A man who's been stabbed in the heart at the edge of a pipe crawls inside it to live with the wound. As he moves down the windy concrete tunnel, listening to his arteries drain, he leaves a red carpet for the assailant's night. The pipe sparkles with light from the twinkle of blood hitting the cold air for the first time after being pumped through the man's heart for so long. The man looks inward in quest of warmth, passing a torn valve in a network of tubing, from waning capillary to enlarged vein geysering woundward. From small tubing to large, the blood flies to its final resting place, varnishing the pipe with a statue erected to the man's aorta by his assailant. The man builds a valve mid-pipe with sheets of dried blood in order to impede his death. The assailant leaving the pipe as a memorial to his crime and victim, paying tribute with a spare part in lieu of tubes torn. The man crawls down the pipe, listening to the valve rustling in the cold wind, leaving a red carpet for the assailant's night. By Richard Gessner. I was dead lying inside an open marble coffin as the mortician injected embalming fluid into my body with a syringe. The inside of the coffin was lined with pink satin. I pulled at it with my fingers and looked up at the mortician as I spoke in a critical tone. Well, what if the worms don't like this? The mortician pretended not to hear me. I stared at his syringe as it penetrated my skin. The embalming fluid felt cool as it rushed through my body, like a refreshing drink of Gatorade on a hot day after baseball practice. Again, I looked up at him and spoke, but I don't want to be preserved. And how are the worms going to get into this marble box after you close it? And what if the worms don't like the taste of the embalming fluid, just like children who won't eat their vegetables? I really do want to smell my very own flesh putrefying. The mortician looked at me smugly as he spoke in a philosophical tone. My friend, you are addicted to sensual pleasure. You are so attached to your own gratifications that I don't believe you are ready for the spiritual plane. I sat up in my coffin and waved my arms about as I spoke. But you're depriving me of my natural processes and desires. My desires. I had wished to view my body as it decomposed and to take photographs of each stage in the process. I took my expensive camera from my pocket and held it up so the mortician could see it. Surely this is not an impractical idea, is it? Surely it can't be. My needs are no different from those of parents who photograph their children at different stages of maturity so they can look back and see how all has changed. The mortician stood motionless with his arms crossed as he shook his head, saying, "So vain, so very, very vain." Richard Gessner. Vanity by Richard Gessner. The Zoobrary by Richard Gessner. The Zoobrary. Beneath a multi-leveled library is a basement zoo where the writers of the books above are kept. The zoo has a honeycomb structure sectioned off by narrow hallways running between circular rows of cells filled with a diverse collection of writers. The zoo has an optimum cross-breeding design. Writers of different type, ability, and degree of stature are paired up in opposite cells with facing bars so they can view only each other. Parking ticket scribblers face classical versifiers. Subpoena makers face street poets to produce spontaneous legal writs. Seminal inventives face shop-worn derivatives to make an accessible would-be radical with a pioneering gloss. The forgotten face the immortal. The touted face the neglected. The Baroque long-winded face terse aphorisms. Scholarly treatise writers face gossip columnists to make high-pulp crops of academic sensation. A zoo breeder wanders through a maze of hallways, listening to the congress of burgeoning tete-a-tetes, caught up in an infectious meld of snowballing ideas. The drone of voices reverberates, causing the caked stratum of upper floor tome dust to shift ever so slightly. Snatches of conversation overheard by diagonally opposite cell occupants are stolen by a web of plagiarism, spreading throughout the honeycomb. Jewel kernels, lost in the generic stew of blended voices, are fished out by the zoo breeder and developed in the throes of invention, while the idle plot to break through the ceilings of their cells, invading the upper floors to rewrite the books of their neighbors. At the center of the honeycomb is an incubator, where the pairs of the most promising writers chosen by the zoo breeder are placed to mate and give birth. When the babies are born, the parents are returned to their cells. The zoo breeder raises the children like a pedantic wet nurse, bringing them to the upper floors for the daily rigors of learning and tome dust castle building, returning them to the incubator where they work themselves up into the prime white heat of prodigyhood, producing seminal works for all posterity to feed off of. These slow runts, who fail to make their mark early, are culled from the revolutionary litter and doomed to wither in a feral state beyond the zoobrary walls. When the fresh crop of genius comes of age, they are placed in their own cells, opposite those of a different type, ability, and stature. The writers are rotated in their cells each time a new generation is added, so new pairs face each other. The inept and barren are weeded out to make room for the new. The promise of future progeny born of fresh pairings keeps evolution inching forward. As the zoo breeder puts the works of the new generation on the upper floor shelves, he looks out a window, watching the cold orphan from a gossip columnist, classical scholar mismatch, roaming the zoobrary grounds, waiting to be let in. The Zoobrary by Richard Gessner.